what the course and the program is going to teach you. I understand that many of you will be eager to go through the course and see what the program has to offer. And because of just the nature and some of the limitations with online learning in this kind of format, it's not possible to show you very quickly everything that you're going to learn. And we don't want you to go and rush through the course and learn things haphazardly as you go. It's only going to make things much more difficult for you to improve. So this video is going to serve as a full overview and a primer for the main techniques that you will learn. It doesn't cover every single technique, and it certainly isn't going to be able to go through all of them in depth at all. And we're not going to be able to explain a lot of how to do things, but I do want you to have a good understanding of the types of things that we are thinking about, the perspective that we are coming from, why we teach you certain things at a certain time in a certain way, and also when you're going through the course and learning the techniques as you go, I want you to always refer back to this video so that you have an understanding about how that fits into the big picture of things. Just due to the nature of the program, and we're actually going to explain that a little bit further in this video, it's just not a effective and beneficial move for you to go through and learn, much later, more advanced concept without having a good understanding of some of the earlier things. It introduces more variables that increase the chance of error at something more basic. And so in order to prevent those issues from arising, but also satisfy your curiosity and help you get an understanding about your journey that you're about to undertake, I'm going to do my best to outline it in an appropriate amount of detail. Now, it's not necessary for you to have a solid understanding of everything that I talk about in this video. You can come back to it as many times as you want throughout your course progress. And as you're going through, things will start making more and more sense to you, even if it feels really overwhelming right now. And it probably will feel quite overwhelming, but by the time you're finished going through the program, you'll actually have a very good level of ability to be able to actually watch a video like this and know exactly what's being talked about and have the answers to all of these question marks that you might have the first time you watch it. And that's a very exciting process that I'm glad I can walk you through. So the first thing to start off with is by saying that learning is frankly a very complex thing. It's something that is often very underestimated in terms of how complex it is by a lot of the people that we work with. So in one example, I often have students that will come and ask me, what is the best way for you to write notes? And this is an incredibly simplistic question because it doesn't look at what note-taking is and the cognitive effects that note-taking can produce. Note-taking, if we look broadly at the research, is something that has been studied for decades, and we still frankly know very little about exactly what makes note-taking effective and what makes it ineffective. There are some techniques out there that have, in some cases, been shown to be very effective. Some ones that come off the top of my head are the Cornwell note-taking method, Zettelkasten note-taking, any form of note-taking that involves a lot of the softwares that we often use. You could even consider flashcards as a form of note-taking. All of these, in some studies, have been shown to be very effective. But then, if you keep reading, you start seeing more studies that show that it's not effective, and in some cases, actually detrimental. And so across the board, when we're trying to see what actually works, or is there something else going on, it's a very confusing and very muddy picture. And so it's very important that we don't oversimplify learning. We shouldn't expect that it's going to be a very simple and straightforward thing to learn, because it's just frankly not. And if we start with that perspective that it's just about this technique and this technique, then it's going to be very difficult to improve and really learn the best techniques that you can use that will work the best for you and all of the different types of challenges you're going to find yourself in. But the thing is that we can't blame general public for thinking that learning is a little simpler than it is. because the research really struggles to address this. Those of you that are very familiar with learning research will know this, and those of you that aren't may learn this for the first time, is that we know, frankly, very little about how learning works in real-world practical settings. A lot of the research that was done around learning and around learning science only started in sort of the 1960s and 70s, especially the 70s onwards. And at that time, there were a whole bunch of schools of thought and theories around how learning could possibly work. And most of those have been shut down, and we don't believe those anymore. But it's a relatively new and recent field of development. But the problem is that learning is something that is almost impossible to directly measure and observe. We can observe someone's note-taking skills, and then we can observe the grades that they get. But now it depends on who marked it, how difficult was the assessment, what were they being assessed on, how difficult did they find it to learn it in the first place, how much prior knowledge do they have, how good was the teacher, how easy was the subject, how easy was the exam. All of these things and many, many more actually influence that relationship. So it's hard to find a one-to-one relationship where we see that one variable creates one effect. And so research needs that type of information to really progress smoothly. And that's the reason why medical research is something that can progress much more quickly, because we're always looking for biomarkers and blood tests and different scans that give us definitive answers about something. But the things that we can't observe, the same thing is the case for medicine as well. There are a lot of medical conditions and diseases that we know very little about because it's so hard to observe it. And without that observation, research is very difficult. So actually, the current research space right now is fairly early, very primitive in its understandings. And so what we know as practitioners and what researchers know through their practice is often decades ahead of where the real research publication sorts of sits in terms of what has been proven. And so there's this big gap that every good educator is going to know about, and it's called the research practice gap. It means that practice is always the thing that leads in front of research. Research will follow behind, sometimes in the span of decades. What we have done with the system that we have created is we started purely from the practice. We just looked at what are the issues that we face in real world settings and how can we fix them. Back in the day, when we were first developing the system, there was no attempt to sell it. We weren't thinking of marketing it. We weren't thinking of even teaching it to other people. All we wanted was a system that would work and deliver real personal results, not in a lab environment like 90% of the studies out there, not only for a specific type of subject, but for real pressures, studying multiple subjects in really difficult time pressured assessments, trying to get sleep, trying to have a social life. With all of these other things going on, we wanted a system that could work. And so that was the primary focus. We didn't care about publishing things. We didn't care about publishing more research. All we did is look at the research out there, extract wherever we could, read lots of books, read lots of articles, and then synthesize and consolidate all of that. And we spent several years doing that to create the system that we've created. And then the next step was, how do we teach that in a way that is effective? How do we teach that in a way that other people can consistently learn? And that was a struggle on its own. And luckily, well, obviously, because I'm here talking to you about this right now, we did find a way. We found a way that we're able to teach this system to new uninitiated people of all different levels of experience to a relatively high level of accuracy and consistency. And the results are fairly predictable. So based on the data that we've collected over the last 4,000 to 5,000 students across the last 2.5 years, we know that around 80% of the people that follow the program and follow the instructions will have the results that we predict. And we actually have found that 100% of the people that follow the instructions and the program as we have laid out will see a positive result. Although for a small percentage of those people, the magnitude of that result may not be as large as we had predicted, or it may take them much longer than we would have normally liked. And I think that's kind of an unavoidable part of delivering something in this way without having that real close one-on-one private coaching level interaction because of the fact that there is variation in the human brain. And so trying to get something that works 100% for 100% of people is probably impossible. And 50 to 70 years from now, when the research does catch up, probably the way that we're teaching you to learn is going to be the way that everyone is taught to learn. It's just that it isn't mainstream right now, but it also means that for you, if you learn this, you have a considerable competitive advantage over just regular people who are still using very outdated methods of learning. So here's what I'm going to go through now. I'm going to lay out the big picture in terms of how we're thinking about learning, the techniques that we're going to teach you, how it all fits in together. So this is going to give you a good, big, broad overview without you having to skip through all the lessons and trawl through hours of videos to figure this out, because this is really what you're wanting to know. And then after that, I'm also going to go through some of the variations within that, as well as some of the considerations. So the things that we are thinking about each of these steps that you have to really watch out for. So that's going to be important. And we're also going to mention that it's not in the same order as what we're going to teach you. So I'm giving you the big overview right now, but we don't teach it to you starting from the beginning to the end. And that's because we realized very early on that that's not the best way to learn it. Instead, there are certain fundamental principles scattered across this entire system that should be developed first, that create kind of these big landmarks that we can bridge between. And then we layer on top of that in an asymmetric fashion until you get up to the full system. So you're not going to learn the perfect version of a single part and then the perfect version of the next part and the perfect version of the next part. Instead, what we're doing is we're laying a strong foundation across the entire board, filling in gaps, making sure that you're getting very good high yield gains in the early stages, and then developing that to the next stage and the next stage and the next stage and the next stage. And some of you will be a little bit better at this part and some of you will be a little bit better at this part. But overall, we've found that most people tend to have at least a couple of gaps somewhere in the early stages. And having even one gap in the early stage can cause the entire system overall to actually crumble. And that's just because, again, learning is really complex, and we, cried blood and sweat and tears and things to create this system that actually really does work. And it's a careful construct in the way that you have to learn it to be able to use it consistently. The most challenging part about that from your point of view is that when you're going through the course, there are going to be certain things that we're going to teach you that you are legitimately just not going to have any idea why you need to develop a certain level of mastery at a certain thing. We will explain it to you, but you may not really necessarily believe it, or you may not really feel that that is true. And this is something that we call insight limiting. So insight limiting is when your own insight into the process limits your insight into the process. So you are really never going to know if something is relevant for something that's more advanced based on what you know, because you may lack the knowledge to see the connection. And there's really no way around that other than sort of having just faith and trust that it is related and it is important in the way that we explain, and putting aside your own sort of sense of overconfidence or whatever it may be that might make you skip that step. So that's something that you have to be really careful of. If you feel the inclination to sort of skip a step because you don't think it's relevant for you, just note it may be because you haven't learned yet the thing that will teach you why this is important for the later thing. And if you were to skip it, it's going to make it much harder, because one of the side effects of the way that we teach it is that because we're teaching it in terms of the foundational principles first across the board, if one part is lagging behind while the other areas are developing, that starts limiting your overall performance. Again, learning is complex and it's not something that we can observe. So in real practice, this is actually what ends up happening, is that if there's an area that is under practiced, and then you have a more advanced version of a system and you have issues with it, and then you submit that to us for feedback and you ask us for help, which we always encourage that you should do. There's many, many ways that you can get help scattered throughout the program, at 24/7 basically. When you ask for help, it's very, very, very challenging, even for a very experienced eye, to see where the problem originates from, because there are now so many more variables that are at play. It's not simply you're at this stage, therefore it could be, one of these 5 or 6 issues. It's these parts are at this stage, but this part might be at this stage. But we don't know that. We don't know which part is holding you back. All we have to go off is just your experience and the work we're able to see. And so when there are all these other things at play, it's incredibly challenging to actually problem solve that. So in this situation, not only is it very disheartening and very frustrating, but actually often it means that you have to then revert back to a lower stage of the course and then just start filling in again from scratch to see what was missed. And that process alone, just figuring out what the problem was, can take months. So the time benefit of skipping something and not practicing something for a few hours just because of the fact that you want to save those few hours could legitimately cost you months of extra time and just backtracking to figure out what was the thing that was missed. So please don't run into that issue. If you were to go 10, 20% slower than you would ideally like to go, you will probably end up saving 200, 300% time in just not making mistakes that cost you months to fix. And really want to make sure that that is clear. So the stage is set in such a way that each stage builds a foundation of knowledge in terms of understanding how learning works and therefore being kind of the mechanic of your own brain, as well as skills, which is practical, real things that you can actually do. Knowledge is understanding how you can do something and what you should do. The skill is being able to execute on that consistently. So there is a big difference between knowing something and being able to actually do it. And this is something that we, again, can't underestimate. You may learn about a certain technique and understand how to apply it, but if you confuse that with being able to actually apply it in the real world, that can cause a lot of issues. Again, because it's insight limiting. So you may not be aware of the fact that you don't have the skills because you think you have the skills because you understand it. So you should only ever verify your skills with real practice and real work that you've gotten feedback on. But the other very important foundation that we're building, which may be the most important foundation of all, is the foundation of experience. So not only is there knowledge, not only is there skill, but there's also experiences that we have to build as you're going through the course stage by stage. And these experiences are twofold. Number one is the types of mistakes and challenges that you will face. What we found through many iterations and close observation of our students was that if we lay things out in a way that is so step by step, with the examples and the explanations perfectly dialed in, we sort of surprisingly at the time found that people did worse at learning the system in the later stages. They really struggled when it became more advanced and when the academic pressures in the real world started getting more intense. And in the research, this phenomenon has actually been documented. It's called the fade out effect. And it talks about how you need to have a certain level of difficulty in the earlier stages because it trains your brain to be able to manage that difficulty. And so one of the things that you'll find going through the program is that sometimes we teach you a technique that we know is restricted and limited in a certain way. And we expect and predict that you will make certain mistakes and have certain challenges. And that is actually deliberate. We want you to feel a certain type of challenge, and then we want you to do your best to overcome that challenge with the limited skills that we have taught you. And then I want you to be able to experience what type of mistake is made. And this is extremely valuable because when we get to the later stages, it means that, first of all, you're going to be able to learn the advanced techniques much more quickly because you have the experience of doing it the wrong way and the mistake to consolidate straight away. So you're going to be able to learn the advanced techniques much, much faster than someone that has never made those mistakes in the first place. But even more than that, the experience of trying to do something and challenging yourself and being uncomfortable is something that is actually unavoidable in the later stages. In the more advanced techniques, it's not cognitively possible to teach those techniques in a way that avoids difficulty, because some of the techniques induce difficulty by nature, because the cognitive effect that we're trying to activate is directly linked with the subjective perception of difficulty and lots of effort and confusion. So when that happens, you're either going to have the experience and the skills to take that confusion and turn it into something productive, or you're not going to have that experience and you're not going to have those skills, and then you'll really, really struggle because it's more difficult and it's more advanced and we don't have those foundational skills. So being able to manage that discomfort, manage that confusion, manage the sort of insecurity with not knowing exactly how to do a technique, but pushing through anyway, and then reflecting on that process to improve, these are all things that are extremely important for your development in the medium to long term. And so as a result, there are certain elements that we know will make you make certain mistakes, and that is completely deliberate. So making those mistakes is actually you progressing through. People that don't make those mistakes find it very difficult to progress because things just don't make sense. They don't see the relevance because they don't have the experience under their belt. So a common question would be, how long does it take to go through this entire process, which I'm just about to start outlining for you? It takes on average around 4 to 8 months. And there is quite a lot of variation, especially in the upper end. It's rare for someone to be able to get a very high level of competency in less than 4 months. Less than 3 months is, I don't think we've ever had anyone that's been able to do it that quickly. But 8 months is very reasonable. For most people, you will start seeing very significant results within the 4 to 8 month period. And so that's a very safe estimate for most people. However, for some students, it will take much longer. So especially if you are not academically very strong, or you're a younger student that doesn't have as much academic experience, for example, if you're in junior high school, or, even for some students, later high school, if you're not like very, very academically invested, it can take 12 to 18 months, potentially even longer. It really does depend, because there are certain things that you need to have. As I've mentioned, you need certain experiences to consolidate certain things and really get your head around them. But with diligent, consistent work, it takes around 4 to 8 months. However, there are a few things that really affect this in a big way, and the two main things is practice and consistency. And I'm not just saying those as fluff words. I actually mean them in terms of very, very specific things. When we're talking about practice, there are two ways that we have found that when this is not done, progress is much, much slower. And that is, number one, which is the obvious one, not enough practice, assuming that you have the skill because you just understand the technique. That's probably the biggest one. But the second one is actually practicing in the wrong way. So practicing in the wrong way is a difficult thing to wrap your head around before learning some of the techniques. But again, because of the fact that learning is complex and it's impossible to really directly observe it, there are many ways that a technique can be interpreted. So we could explain something, we could have examples, we could walk through, we could give you feedback, but there are always going to be certain variables, certain thoughts and certain patterns and certain habits that you bring to the table that affect that. So even if it feels on the surface like we're on the same page, we might not exactly be on the same page. And so those tiny little variations can actually have an impact in terms of your ability to learn the technique properly and progress through. And so to remediate that, we need a method of practicing that makes you, the learner, very aware of the possible deviations so that you can catch them, because it's just not going to be possible for someone else to catch them. Even if I was to look at you, 24/7 and look for any possible issues, there are going to be some things that only happen inside your head that only you can be aware of, that you're going to need to catch yourself on. And so we teach you the method of practice that we have designed, modified of various other practice frameworks that we have found are specifically designed to cue you in to finding possible areas of weakness or misinterpretation or mistakes that you're making that you may not be aware of. So you'll learn this method of practice. It happens relatively early on in the course, but if you don't practice in that way, You'll probably still improve, but at a certain point, you will probably stop improving quite as much, or you may just stop improving altogether. And that again is very frustrating because you can practice and practice and practice, and it doesn't feel like anything is happening. It can be a very disheartening process, and that's usually because of the fact that the method of practice is not actually picking up on these errors. And again, it's insight limiting. We wouldn't even know what those areas of weakness are until you start engaging in that process. And then once you start practicing the right way, we can then work with you again because there's more data, there's more information, so we can help you with that problem solving process. So those are the two things that would make a really, really big difference in terms of how long you can expect to spend on the course to master everything. However, there is also the aspect of consistency that I talked about. When I talk about consistency, I'm talking about, again, learning all the foundations properly in the right way, getting a good level of competency before moving on. But it's also talking about something that we call tug of war practice. We have found this to be increasingly common, especially among students that are very fixed in certain habits of studying. We found this with students that are very, very obsessed with linear note taking or extremely invested in one system like Zettelkasten, for example, of note taking. Because there are these existing habits, there is a natural tendency to use those habits when we're studying. Sometimes we are aware of that. We're sort of aware that we're reverting back to something because we don't want to use a new technique that we've learned. Or we're not even aware of that because we go into it with the intention of using a new technique. And as we do it, we sort of end up sort of subconsciously reverting. Our cognitive processes are not really what is being taught. It might look similar on paper, but we're sort of thinking in the same old way, just dressing it up in the new kind of note-taking structure or reading structure or whatever it is that we're teaching you. That is what we call tug of war practice, because what's necessary as part of this is cognitive retraining. We need to reprogram the natural tendencies and habits that you are using when you're studying. So when you're reverting back to old processes, it prevents your brain from having the pressure to change and retrain the way that it's used to thinking. So if you're spending sort of half the time using a new technique and then half the time using the old technique, you can see that your brain isn't really going to be retraining itself as effectively as it could be. So that's just one thing to be aware of. And again, the method of practice that we're going to teach you is designed in such a way that it cues you in to being more aware of those types of tendencies. So if you are starting to do this tug of war practice, the method of practice that we teach you should pick up on that. So you should be able to catch yourself before it becomes an issue. But don't be disheartened, because even though I say 4 to 8 months, it's not as if it takes 4 months to start seeing an effect. You will start seeing effects and benefits from really your first few days, because we're teaching you things at a foundation level to begin with. So for some people that completely lack those foundation, they'll see very significant, quite dramatic improvements in just the first sort of week or two. And actually, if you read some of our reviews and testimonials, you'll see that some of those are written by people that have only been on the course for like a couple of weeks. So if you're lacking a couple of these foundations, which again, I said most people are lacking at least one, you'll see a pretty big improvement in a certain domain straight off the bat. If you already have a really, really solid set of foundations, you may only find that that first area is improving things for you by only 5 or 10%. But it's still 5 or 10% better than where you were before. Or it may make you refocus and reprioritize on something that you kind of do, but you're not really doing as actively as we recommend that you should do. So those little optimizations are really important for just setting a really firm foundation. As you progress through the course even further and we learn more techniques, the improvement becomes much more predictable. In the beginning, people come with all these different methods of thinking and all these different ideas around learning. So the results in the early month is variable. As you go through and those thoughts are refined and developed further and further, the results are more predictable because there aren't these wild fluctuations from all these differing kind of practices. And so in the later stages, sort of now we're talking about after the first month leading up to the sort of 4 to 8 month period, we should start seeing gentle linear improvements in the studying process with a few kind of jumps here and there as you hit each new milestone. So it's not a binary thing. It's not like you will just struggle for 4 to 8 months and then suddenly you're going to be good. You're just going to be progressively getting better and better and better. We're just saying that it will take 4 to 8 months for you to get to a level of mastery where we would say, yes, you've actually learned the techniques to a good level of competency. To fully master it to the point where it's essentially perfect, you just add a few more months onto that. So let me now go into the big picture of how everything is set up. And again, if it feels overwhelming, then don't worry too much. You can come back to this as much as you need to. So very simplistically, we are viewing this process here, where there is information that's coming in, and then that information is going to then be processed. And not only is it going to be processed, we're processing it in such a way that it allows us to have retention and retrieval. So we can really say that if we haven't achieved retention and retrieval, then we haven't achieved effective learning. Now, it's about more than this because retention has different levels. There's different levels of depth to which we're able to understand something, and that's going to be reflected at the different levels at which we're able to retrieve something. So for example, just recalling a fact is going to be at a different level of retrieval depth than utilizing that for very complex problem solving with multiple other concepts. And the process through which we are processing the information will affect the ability for us to retrieve it at those levels. But on top of that, we're also looking at the self-management strategies and skills to be able to engage in these processes effectively. As a common example, if you are a serious procrastinator, it doesn't really matter how good your techniques are for studying. If you never study, you're never going to use those techniques. So we also look at the self-management strategies that enable you to use these techniques and strategies day in, day out, not being affected by the distractions or procrastinations or time management tendencies. So that's the big picture of what we're going to go through. So if you take nothing away from this, just think, what is this course teaching me and how does it fit into there? Is this helping me with the processing? Is it helping with the self-management? Is it helping me with the information retention and retrieval? Or is it helping me with a combination of all three? And you can have ideas about that. What I'm now going to do is I'm going to break this up a little bit more and go through a little bit more in detail so you have a better idea about how the system is meant to work. So the problem here is that most people are not really aware of the process around how retention and retrieval occur. They sort of just think about retention and retrieval and it's just this binary outcome. It either happened or it didn't happen. And you usually find out in an exam if you're a student or when your boss or supervisor or coworker gives you an odd look if you're a professional and you just don't know your stuff properly. And so the solution to that is putting a greater attention onto the actual process. And a good example of where this really goes out of control is something like flashcards, which is a very, very common method of learning with just something called spaced repetition, which is actually called spaced retrieval in the proper terminology for it. So something like spacing and the spacing effect, which is the cognitive effect responsible for spaced retrieval, is something that we found in lab studies to be effective in short-term intervals in a very isolated set of circumstances. But again, those of you that are very deeply familiar with the research on this will actually know that the way that people are recommended to use spaced repetition and flashcards in popular media, YouTube, by social media influencers, even by some schools and universities, is very out of proportion to what the research actually says. What the research doesn't say, has never looked at, is what it is like for real students facing authentic academic pressures. So namely, what we're talking about here is that we do not know if this type of strategy is effective if you have multiple subjects, you've got time pressured assessments with multiple assessments pressuring you at the same time, when you have to have a level of knowledge mastery that is deeper than just fact recall. So for example, problem solving or using multiple concepts together. And we don't know if that's effective long term. So most of the studies are only looking at it in terms of minutes or hours after learning it to see whether you're able to retain it or not. And a lot of the studies are just doing just word pairs. They're just irrelevant pieces of information. And so it's kind of been taken from that research, which has said it's been effective for these instances, and then people have sort of started recommending it without any of those limitations in place. And so the latest research that's coming out is starting to show that it's not really having consistent results. Now that lots of people are using it, we're seeing that most people that use this are not getting the results that it's meant to have. It's very time consuming. It takes time away from other things in their studying that they could be doing that could even be more beneficial. So right now we know that it is effective for some instances, but the way that it's being used is grossly disproportionate to how effective it actually is. And so if all you know is that's the only sort of piece of strategy or theory that you know, and someone is saying like me, that's not going to work for you, then that's very destabilizing. And so instead of focusing on just the technique, it's more important to think about the principle behind the technique, because then we can start adapting it. Even if the technique doesn't work, we can modify it in a way that does work. And this is very important for you as you progress through the program. You have to learn the techniques, but also the principles underneath it, so that after you finish the program, you don't have to just continually watch the videos to learn how to do the technique again. You can, again, be the mechanic of your own brain. You can problem solve these things more authentically yourself without needing so much external input. You can kind of go off of what we call first principles, which is logically figuring it out based on the knowledge that you know. And we see the same problem like we saw with flashcards. We see the same thing with note-taking. There are so many methods of note-taking that are recommended, but actually, when you look at the research on note-taking, none of those methods have really been shown to be effective in real-world settings. Same thing with homework. We know from research that doing homework across an entire school seems to improve achievement rates, but we don't really think that it helps students that are already doing okay to do even better, and we don't actually see that same effect at an individual level. So what that means is that there's a lot more going on behind the scenes that these studies are maybe not really looking at. And they will probably start looking at them over the next 10 to 20 years. But right now, if you're really focusing on just getting results for yourself in real world practice, we need to have a nuanced view of what the research tells us, as well as what practice and experience tells us. And so we're here to kind of bridge those things together, because obviously we are knowledgeable and have a lot of experience in both of those domains. Because the worst case scenario is really for you to use a technique that doesn't produce a certain result, and therefore you need another technique just to fix the symptom of the first one, and then that is another result, and then you need another technique to fix that one. And that is actually what's happening. There are people that are using studying techniques that are fundamentally heading in the wrong direction. It's going to cause some good effects, but a huge host of bad effects as well. And then instead of just changing the direction to another strategy that has less bad things and more of the good things, we just add new techniques onto it. So let's say we're writing notes in a bad way, and so this is wasting time, and we're not having a great memory, and we're not able to retrieve it in an effective way, and we don't have a good depth of knowledge mastery. So because we're not able to retain it, we add on all these flashcards, and that helps us to retain some of the information. But because we can't have a deeper level of knowledge mastery, we start doing more and more practice questions. And because now our depth of knowledge is directly related to the number of practice questions we do, we just need more and more and more practice questions until we are doing, thousands and thousands of questions. But now we don't have any time to do anything else, so we're sacrificing on our sleep. So in order to make sure that we're getting enough sleep, we're having to cut out all of our hobbies and other things, and that's actually reducing our overall cognitive effectiveness. And so to make up for that, we're thinking about what we need to eat better in order to enhance our cognitive function, or what we need to do to, what game we need to play to do that. And then that's cognitively exhausting in itself. And so that's making us procrastinate more and get more distracted. So, now we have a whole other range of issues. So you can see how each band-aid solution is only really fixing it short term, but it's kind of making the whole thing worse. So when we designed the system, that was very front and center in our mind, in terms of we cannot let that happen, because that's the worst case scenario. So we sort of just wiped the slate clean and said, well, what do we need to do to make sure that this process, which is the core of effective learning, happens smoothly with as few of those negative side effects as possible. And so that's why the system that we teach is extremely novel. It's just it's very different to the conventional methods of learning. But again, actually, once you learn it, you'll probably find that it's very natural and very logical. And you'll look at the old way that you studied and think that it doesn't even make sense why that even was a method of studying that existed in the first place. That's often what a lot of our students will say. So when we think about information we can divide that into a few processes. So we need to be able to scope the information, we need to be able to evaluate the information, and then we need to be able to make a plan based on those evaluations. So at this point, there are a few things that we need to be considering. We need to be considering the depth of the resources that we are using, the language that it's using, and how appropriate it is for our learning needs. Normally, when we're scoping information and we're trying to normally we're not even scoping or evaluating the information at all. We just dive into it, head first. The reason that scoping is important is because it allows us to create a plan in terms of how we can draw on information. And this reduces certain negative cognitive effects that can hold you back in the later stages. It sort of lubricates the overall experience of learning because we're not having to stop and exert cognitive resources in figuring out where to get the answer to certain things. Another benefit that it has is that it allows us to form knowledge schemas a little bit more quickly and more efficiently across a broader range, because it's allowing us to see the extent at which relationships and schemas can be formed rather than it being limited to a single class or a single lecture. And that's extremely important. Once we start limiting it to a single class or a single lecture, we are artificially blocking out a lot of those relationships that we could be forming. That means that our schema is going to be smaller. And the detriment of a smaller schema is that it means that there are less things for us to leverage off in our future learning. The more you know, the easier it is to learn more things. It's very difficult to learn something that's more advanced if you lack the basic understanding. And the same is the case for a single lecture. Having something in lecture 5 may help you to learn something in lecture 1. You may not need to know it in depth, but even just knowing that it exists and the general nature of that relationship makes a big difference. And so some of the techniques that we'll teach you will be about either scoping it accurately, because we have to think about, is this the appropriate resource? Do we need to use this? Do we not need to use this? And make a decision about that. We then need to make a decision about what we're doing with what we scoped. What is important? How do we decide what is important? How do we decide what is timely? And then creating a plan. And then being able to do all of this in a time efficient manner without it being like an entire study session by itself, because that obviously defeats the purpose of it being time efficient. So these are the things that we think about here. Once we've created a plan, we've scoped everything out, then we can move on to the act of really processing it. Now, from a cognitive point of view, we've actually already started processing it in these early stages. Once we started scoping through the information, our brain started worrying and trying to form some of these knowledge schemas. Again, if we were thinking and processing that information in the right way. But now we're going to kick it up a notch. We're going to take those raw materials and we're going to start really building a few things. So the considerations here that we want to tick off, where our attention is and where our focus is. So there's a lot of information that we can be consuming, especially across an entire topic if you're studying sort of multiple lectures at the same time. And so bringing your attention just from the beginning all the way through to the end is not often a great order in which to learn the information, because again, there are going to be sort of fundamental milestones that if you could unlock those, it speeds up the entire rest of the process. So your job is really to find where those milestones are as quickly as possible and get those kind of landmark posts in your brain, and then start linking those together to form a very big picture overall scaffold and knowledge schema. And so the method through which we do that is fairly specific, because if we read a heading, we have to make a decision about, is it important or not? It could say it's important in the textbook, but then in another textbook, maybe that's not the heading. So in that case, which is more important? Or maybe it's actually something else, a bold word, or maybe it's an entire paragraph that you choose to turn into a keyword. We have to make a decision about which method is going to produce a landmark that is the most efficient. And again, we have to do that in a time efficient manner. And it depends again on the topic. It depends on your familiarity with it. One of the things that we can do to make that a little bit faster is really look for what we call analogous relationships. Analogous relationships are using our prior knowledge to help us understand new information more quickly. The considerations here are that we don't want to be influenced in a negative way by those analogous relationships. So again, there are techniques and systems in terms of how we can leverage our prior knowledge without making us biased in the new information that we learn and therefore learn it incorrectly. So for example, you may have something new that you learn that feels very similar to something else that you already know. And if that is not actually accurate, that would have a negative effect on your schema formation, which you'd then have to spend time and resources later to correct yourself on. Usually because you realize that you got a test question wrong, or you don't really understand how something works, and now you have to reflect back and think, something went wrong, where did it go wrong? that's a very time consuming process. In some cases, it's not even possible to really correct that, which is why some misunderstandings can be prevalent and persist in your brain for years and years and years and years, going completely unchallenged. We want to use analogous relationships to speed up that pattern recognition and to be able to learn new information more quickly, but we also want to do it in a way that holds us back from being too overzealous with that process and making relationships that we really shouldn't have made. So there's a balance there in terms of the critical thinking. And again, there are techniques and systems that will teach you in order to do that. In the early stages, it'll look just like leveraging off of prior knowledge in very, very simple ways. Just getting used to the habit of drawing off prior knowledge to start hypothesizing on connections. And then the next stage after that, we teach you how you can take those hypotheses and start prioritizing the possible relationships in terms of which one has a higher likelihood of being accurate. And then the stage after that, we're looking at how do we prioritize the more accurate ones to the one that is going to be the most time efficient for us and is going to serve us the best for whatever retrieval purposes that we need to use it for. And that series actually occurs through multiple stages where you learn that progressively as you go. Obviously, you're not going to be able to do the later version of that technique without being very, very familiar with working through those analogous relationships at a basic level first. And ultimately, what this is going to allow us to do is have what we've been talking about is that knowledge schema creation. Those of you that are well-versed in educational theory know that knowledge schema, the word schema is quite a technical term, but actually there are things to do with what is called schema theory that are a little bit complicated and don't necessarily really fit into what I'm talking about right now. So I'm talking about the word schema in a more general sense. I'm talking about a general model of thinking, a general scaffold. In the program, we often use the word backbone to refer to the overall structure in which we can think about information. The schema is very important because we have to develop the schema to be able to develop sub-schemas and to advance our knowledge even further. Without having a good understanding of how we need to think about the information, it becomes very hard to assign relevance to the information. After all, if information comes in and our brain doesn't know how to think about it, why would it hold on to that information? In fact, it doesn't. It's a waste of energy, and so it's very efficient at removing that. Overcoming that is our primary goal. We are manually, forcibly asserting significance and relevance to information for new information that we may not really care much about and tricking our brain to holding on to it and not bidding it so freely. And that relies on forming a schema that was able to give relevance to that information. So all of these things allow us to create that schema. In the early stages of your technique, what you're going to learn is how we can start forming a schema. Any kind of schema. And we're going to get experience at how different types of schemas have different effects on our memory and different effects on our experience of learning more detailed and advanced knowledge. As we continue to progress through, you're going to learn about how you can prioritize those schemas and then how you can use methods of note-taking to facilitate the creation of those schemas and actually be more accurate and faster at creating those schemas than if you didn't have that particular note-taking strategy. So that's what comes in next, is how do we use note-taking, the act of just physically representing our ideas, to facilitate and enhance the cognitive processes rather than holding it back. There are lots of things to think about here, even things like the color you use, the spatial arrangement, where you've put it, where you decide to put it, the type of arrows you use, even font size and the width, whether you write it versus whether you type it. All of these things actually have a small but cumulatively significant influence on the learning outcome and the schema formation. So in the early stages, you're going to learn techniques on note taking. If you're a traditionally very linear note taker, it's going to allow you to open up and just express ideas at a greater level of depth. Linear note taking is very, very locked in. Expressing relationships of even just 3 different things together is very wordy and time consuming. And if you've got, let's say, 7 different ideas that are all interrelated together, trying to explain that through words is very, very tedious, and it's very hard to read through and understand it again afterwards. So we're going to be using non-linear note taking structures. We're going to teach you some very basic ways to use that note taking to enhance certain key cognitive features, such as getting higher quality chunking, such as propelling your analogous relationship formation. Then the next stage is how to clean up that note-taking technique, remove some of the redundancy, speed things up a little bit more, and really start optimizing it. At that point, you've already really got a 50 to 60% of all the benefit that you're going to get from that. And in the later stages after that, we're just continually refining and optimizing it. So there's still a lot of improvement that can be had, but these early stages are important for just getting that basic new habit of associating what happens in our brain and the relationships and the thought process with what we're actually writing down, and then creating that feedback loop. So that takes a period of weeks just to get that association down. And then we can refine that. And the best thing about this is because your note taking will be so closely matched to your thinking process, it makes it much easier for us to help you by diagnosing the problems. We can see your work and we can say, if you truly did have a congruent note-taking technique, you would have not drawn this here unless you thought in this particular way. And then so when we bring that up to you, it's a lot easier to have that discussion and diagnosis because it allows us to directly observe and measure the learning process that's occurring, at least a little bit more clearly than just kind of watching your eyes and expression and just hearing your subjective experience about it. Now, there's a few other things that we need to think about here in terms of how do we actually start integrating all those fine details that we'd need to know, and they're very small specifics. That's obviously important in terms of like examinations and assessments, but it can really screw up with everything else because details are so compelling and there's so much of it that if we're not good at managing those details and we're not good at prioritizing where to put it, how to express it, how to integrate it, and how to change our knowledge schemas to compensate for them, depending on which information source it came from, at what stage of the learning you were doing this, and how important it is for you to actually hold on to that information. If we're not managing that properly, our notes and our schema can just blow open out of proportion because in terms of sheer volume, there is just so many details. So it's a very careful thing that we need to be very attentive to and very deliberate in how we are processing that information. So in the early stages, we don't really touch that at all. Really, we just mostly advise you to use various small memorization aids. We utilize things like flashcards, things that are very easy to do. They're not the most effective way of doing it, but allows us to manage it to an acceptable level until we build these other skills. Once the other skills are more solid, we're then going to teach you more advanced methods of integrating that information. But it's important that we're not integrating that at an earlier stage because it can make it so much harder to develop the more core skills that I've been talking about so far. Once we've processed this in the right way, we should naturally see that we are having a higher level of retention and our retrieval is to a greater level of depth. That should be a natural consequence of the process that we're doing. And it makes a lot of sense that the outcome in our brain depends on the process in our brain. So that is indeed what happens. However, there are still things that we can do to optimize this. And specifically, that's in the way that we practice the retrieval and things like spacing. So when it comes to something like spacing, what we see is that the spacing intervals and the amount that we have to go through with each space retrieval varies massively depending on how good the process was beforehand and how well we manage the details. So a key sign of someone that didn't learn all the previous steps correctly would be that they're still getting overwhelmed with how much they need to repeat on a constant or frequent basis. That suggests that there was a management of the details and knowledge schema at an earlier level that was still not cognitively optimized, and therefore they're having to overcompensate for them with just repetition. So that's a sign that we can go back to and then start optimizing a few things a little bit further. However, if we do have it well optimized, we want to think about how we're spacing them out. And aspect that often people don't think about very much is when we're spacing them out in the context of even like a single day. So people think a lot about the spacing interval, how long the gap needs to be between each retrieval session. However, many people don't think about what they can do in little gaps and pockets of time. So 2 minutes here, 3 minutes here, 5 minutes here throughout the day. It's very difficult to utilize that time if you have a high dependency on these space retrieval sessions because you've got so much to cover in a short period of time. But if you have a good knowledge schema and if you've managed the details correctly, there are some parts of information that can be consolidated very effectively by using tiny pockets of time that would not normally be accessible throughout the day. And this is a concept called micro-learning that we have sort of adapted, and we've found that certain parts of that fit very well with this current schema of doing things. The other thing that we need to think about is interleaving. Now, interleaving is quite a big topic, but it involves sort of breaking up your revision sessions and your study sessions so that it isn't a single massed block. And with each attempt, looking at it from different angles and challenging yourself in different ways. And we've found that interleaving is something that is actually very easy to learn. It's very easy to do. It produces a very powerful, immediate cognitive effect. And it kind of weirdly doesn't even matter how good you are at any of the other stuff. If you do that, you get an immediate improvement. Obviously, if you do the other stuff well, the improvement is more. But just doing it produces a huge benefit, which is why it's one of the first things that you're actually going to learn is all the different ways that you can do good interleaving to produce these very, very good effects. And as you do more of the interleaving, you actually start getting better at the processing of it as well, because your brain starts learning new patterns of thinking. So it helps with the encoding and re-encoding cycle. Now, on top of this, we have to think about how all of this is going to feed back into what we're actually doing. So the results and the data that we get from here is important for us to infer how good we did all the previous steps before this. So if we didn't do the processing well, we may see that there are issues with our retention or our retrieval later on. So we have to make a decision about what is the issue that we are seeing, how significant is the issue that we are seeing, and what does the issue actually mean in terms of our process. We have to have that sort of diagnostic eye. We can't be binary about this. We can't say there is an issue, something went wrong. Even though that's true, that doesn't really help us because there's so many things that could have gone wrong. So we need to be more specific in terms of this went wrong, and therefore it's most likely to be this, or this. And then you can use the method of practice that we teach you to start diagnosing and problem solving that in a very effective and time efficient way. So those of you that are familiar with some of my YouTube videos, you may see me talking about certain aspects of this here and there, but they're talked about on YouTube much more superficially because of the fact that, no one can be bothered to watch like a huge video of like 6 hours talking about a single technique just to do it the right way. In the course, it's going to go through it in a lot more depth. But the other thing is that there's a lot of variation with each of the steps as well. So for example, let's talk about just note taking, because that's something that often people are very curious about. I teach a method of note taking, which is very, very specific, where you can make for example, a mind map looking structure, and it may seem relatively simple. And so you may be tempted to just go and try to do that straight off the bat to the best of your ability. And there's no problem with giving it a go. But the problem is in assuming that because it looks a little similar, that it was actually the right process if all the other background stuff wasn't there. So for example, one of the things that you're going to learn very, very early on that we develop across the entire course is the ability to group information in a meaningful way. Grouping information is easy. Really, anyone can group information. Grouping information in the best way for your memory, for your retrieval and retention is very, very difficult because there are so many ways that information can be grouped, because the way you group information affects the way you group the rest of the information. That affects the relationships that you form. That affects your knowledge schema. And that affects everything else. That affects the details that you're going to manage. But then on the other hand, the way you manage your details affects what information you think is more or less important, which is going to affect the way that you're going to group the information. So if you manage your details incorrectly, and then therefore you misattributed something as more important than it really is, and therefore you group something in the wrong way, it's very difficult to notice that and then regroup it. So when we're grouping it, there are a lot of things that we are thinking about. In the early stages, we're going to teach you very, very simple grouping just to get used to grouping information. This will be a very easy process for most people, and it will already start having some benefits. One of the most challenging things that we're going to teach you, especially in the early to mid stages of the course, is exactly how to group information in a way that is perfectly cognitively optimized. And this is one of the very unique things that we discovered kind of almost by accident. And then once we started noticing it, we dove into it extensively, and we looked at all the research around why this could be happening. And so it aligns very closely with concepts that we call chunking, as well as the theory of cognitive load theory. And we've created this sort of system of how you can create a cognitively optimized group. But the way that you do that is extremely, extremely specific, to the point where there's really no possible way that you can do it right the first go, partly because of the fact that it actually takes a certain number of mistakes to start even being aware of what the right way even looks like. So we often find with people that are not practicing sufficiently that they think they have learned it, but then they decide the technique is not effective because they're not getting the results. But actually, the problem is that they didn't learn the technique properly, and they think the technique's not effective because they're not using the right technique. But again, it's insight limiting. So they don't know that they're doing it the wrong way. So it's kind of like a chicken and egg situation. You need to know what you don't know to realize that you did it the wrong way. And so our approach and our advice for this is don't fall into that trap to begin with. Start by learning it slowly and getting lots of feedback so that each component is right. And once all the ingredients are of high quality, when we bring them together, it should produce a predictable result. And if it doesn't, the types of mistakes are also predictable. But if the materials, if each ingredient is a little bit off, when we put it together, we're going to start getting unpredictable problems where trying to see where it went wrong is essentially impossible. You're going to have a bad experience. You're not going to have good results. We're not going to have good experience. And no one wins in that situation. Really, no one wins. And it's going to take you so much more time to then learn it again properly. So please don't do that. And then finally, coming up here, we've got the self-management strategies. So when it comes to self-management, we're thinking about things like focus, procrastination, and distractions, how distractible you are. We're thinking about things like motivation and consistency and time, as well as task management. And all of these things affect each other. You know, your level of focus affects your procrastination, which affects your motivation, and your motivation affects your procrastination, which affects your level of focus, and the time and task management affects your motivation and your procrastination. All of these things affect each other. But we can break this down a little bit further. So when it comes to something like focus, we're going to be looking at how you are triggering focus, how you're creating routines of focus, how you're optimizing your environment, where your attention is in terms of what you think produces focus versus what really produces focus, and methods to start evaluating that by yourself. Likewise, very similar for procrastination. We need to understand what the triggers for procrastination are. We need to be very in tune with what our habits are in terms of why we procrastinate, how we procrastinate, and the cognitive chain that occurs. And then we can start working on strategies that will break those cognitive chains, make it easier to stop procrastinating, and eventually make it so that not procrastinating becomes a new habit. And that obviously has flow-on effects with your focus and distractibility as well. When it comes to something like motivation, we're now thinking about how much dependency you have on willpower and motivation, how fluctuant your productivity is based on your motivation, what are the extrinsic versus intrinsic sources of motivation, and how you're managing both of those, and therefore how you can optimize both of those and create systems that are, number one, more habit dependent, and number two, less motivation dependent overall, where habits form part of that. But the other aspect is how your processes themselves are going to drive motivation and allow you to hold that motivation in reserve so that it's not constantly being drained and exhausted. And then when it comes to time and task management, we're thinking about a range of different things. One of the most important things being how you prioritize and the frameworks through which you prioritize, whether you prioritize actively, and how you decide whether something is important or not important. And you'll learn that there are some methods of thinking that make us think something is important, but actually another method of thinking would make us realize that it's actually not as important as we thought it was. And so we're going to teach you some of those things, and then how you can integrate those seamlessly into things like time blocking and time management, and some of the overrated parts about time management that take more time to set up than it would give and free up for you. So some traps when it comes to time management, which is why some people can have amazing schedules or be trying to schedule every single day for years and still feel like they've got problems with time management. These are a lot of the traps that you can run into. So obviously there's a lot to talk about, and believe it or not, I'm really just scratching the surface. I could talk about any single aspect of this for probably a couple hours just on that alone, at least. So all of this stuff is taught in the course, and you can see how everything is going to relate to each other. So when I talked about those foundations and building everything in a way that you're able to really learn it, I'm talking about this sequence. By the time you finish this program, you're going to know how to do all of this. And you're going to know the optimum way to do every single component of what I talked about. and you're going to feel the results for yourself. But if you're in such a rush to try to learn everything without getting the foundations, you're going to find it's not a good time. Okay. So again, we know that 100% from the data that we've collected from thousands of students from around the world of all different levels, 100% of the students that have followed the instructions and have gone through the course have found a benefit of some level. Over 80% have found a dramatic, game-changing level of impact. So I want you to keep this in mind, is that when you go through the program for yourself and you start kind of understanding a little bit more about the techniques and you're starting to apply them, if you get to a point where you're feeling, I'm not actually getting any benefit from this, there is a very, very strong sign, almost guaranteed actually, that there is some aspect of the way that you're practicing or progressing through the program that is slightly, maybe subtly deviating from what is recommended. So at that time, at the earliest possible time, when you notice this is not really as good as it should be, please send through your approach and your work to get feedback. And when you send it through for feedback, we will be able to see and give you advice and help you work through that process. But it's important to be open-minded. You're in this program so that you can really learn these skills. There's no point coming into it thinking you already know everything and having these very, very fixed ideas about what you need to do and how you need to develop it. Trust us, we are the experts at doing this. If there was a better way, we would do it. But through our close observation, we have found that this is the most effective way to teach you. I mean, if your brain is exploding at this stage, that's fine. It's expected. There's a lot. It was overwhelming. There's heaps of stuff that we talked about. But you can refer to this again and again and again to see how each of the techniques that we teach you will fit into this. So hopefully, with this in mind, you won't feel tempted to sprint through and access later techniques or not practice the current techniques that you're currently working on because you think they're irrelevant or they're too easy or whatever ideas that you might have. Really, the whole point of this entire video is so that you just practice what is in front of you, because if you do, and if you can master just what is immediately in front of you as you naturally progress through the